Hello, everybody. Hey, thank you for coming out. So yeah, as Sybil said, I'm going to be talking about kind of, in some ways, the last 10,000 years of history in this place over the next 10 minutes, so buckle your seatbelts. It's going to be a wild ride. What we have here is a map that I created through my research over the last 6 or so years of kind of indigenous habitation in the area immediately surrounding the Iron Creek Preserve. Iron Creek Preserve, if you can see, is this little green box here on the map. This is Iron Lake. I've got Iron Creek highlighted in blue there. All those green lines are trails, and I'll actually, maybe we'll come back to this slide in a little bit and I'll explain some more of these icons as we move on.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. I just, can we see what slides I have really quick? Cool, this is what I want to start with, perfect. So this is a map of our best approximation of vegetation around the time of settlement. So in the early 1800s, surveyors came through southern Michigan and methodically crisscrossed the state and took notes of mostly what kind of trees they found along the way. And MNFI, the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, went through all of these notes. And you go back one slide, please. So this is the actual handwritten notes from the surveyor for the area closest to the Iron Creek Preserve. So there are books and books and pages of this chicken scratch that MNFI went through and deciphered and took data points and created this map that we see on the next slide. But just really quickly, this is the one that's the closest transect to the Iron Creek Preserve. And you can't read it, but it says that there was a whitewood that was 25 inches in diameter. There was a stream that was 10 lengths across. That's Iron Creek that they're talking about. Then they set a quarter post, and there was a black oak and a hickory, exactly. That was
12 inches?
Well, yeah, 12. The hickory was 12 inches, and the black oak was 15 inches in diameter. And then, so those are just south of the preserve. Just north of the preserve is a white oak. And then even farther north of the preserve, there is another hickory and white oak. And so if we go to the map.
This one?
The next one, sorry. This kind of tan color is oak hickory forest. And so that one data point that showed the black oak and hickory is right about here. And so you can kind of see they did a lot of, that's all the data they had to make this map. And they did a lot of kind of guessing with soil types, topography, to kind of create what this would have looked like. This dark blue up here, where the white oak, the lone white oak was, is mixed oak savanna. So savanna is known for being a lot of grassland with trees interspersed. So, and then at the very western edge, there's a little green stripe, that's mixed hardwood swamp, which actually follows kind of the course of Iron Creek and one of its tributaries. So, and there's one little blip of mixed oak forest, which means that they probably found black oaks and white oaks in that area. So those are kind of the three main vegetation types that were here when Europeans first came through, then were able to document it with some semblance of science. But this history really begins 10,000 years ago when the glaciers first retreated. And so as the glaciers retreat, they're leaving bare soil, and ecological succession is starting almost immediately. You have bare soil, then lichens and mosses move in, then you have grasses and forbs, and eventually shrubs and trees. But also with that, you'll also have animals and their predators, animals being ourselves, and we are also the predators of many animals that were moving into the area. And it's important to realize that, over these 10,000 years, humans are basically helping create this ecosystem. We are ecosystem engineers, much like beavers are. And there are a lot of theories as to what makes humans bigger and better and greater than the rest of the living stuff in the world. Not that we are necessarily, but one theory that's out there is that it's our use of fire. Plenty of other languages or species have language, they use tools, but nobody else really uses fire like we do. So that's a theory that I prescribe to. And so you have this humans over 10,000 years setting fire to the landscape, and that is basically setting back the ecological succession. So it's knocking back trees, it's knocking back shrubs, and creating this kind of mix of the savannas, the woodlands, then you have the wetlands, of course, that are mixed in between there. And that's important because the areas of highest diversity in ecosystem are also the most healthy, and the most healthy or the most diverse areas that you can find are where two ecosystems meet at this kind of transition zone. And so you see this map and you see how many different ecosystems or different kind of like ecological snapshots you have in different areas. And so each one of those spots is a place of incredibly high diversity. And so that's not only good for us because it means we have more resources to our disposal. Disposal means there's more resources available to everybody. And so fire played a huge role in that, apart from us just using wood for our fires, cooking and that kind of stuff. We're taking down trees. So that's just kind of an idea of how this landscape got to be the way it was. We're setting fires for a lot of different reasons, but at the end of the day, these fires are drastically altering the landscape, and even though it may be immediately devastating, maybe killing a lot of things, in the long term it is really kind of growing this diversity and health of an ecosystem in an area. So the glaciers retreat about 10,000 years ago, and the first people that are moving through are small groups of people, maybe 5 to 20 people at a time. There's small families that can really subsist off of what they can immediately take off the landscape. And this continues in southern Michigan for almost 10,000 years, and we don't really see any signs of quote-unquote advanced culture in southern Michigan until about 500 BC. And this is when you have these peoples kind of collectively known as the mound builders come into southern Michigan. And the mound builders is an extremely generic term because it covers some 5,000 years of history, starting down in Louisiana. At Watson Break is kind of the oldest mound that we can know of. And then over these 5,000 years, you have different civilizations essentially that are not necessarily related to each other except for broad cultural concepts like mound building, go up the Mississippi River Valley, and by the time they get to Michigan in 500 BC, a lot of these other ones down in Louisiana have already disappeared, and the ones we have in Michigan are kind of like the last gasp of this mound builder culture. And we do have some mounds in the Irish Hills, or we had some mounds in the Irish Hills. Most of them have been destroyed by farmers. If I'm remembering correctly, these two dots down here are sites of mounds. But largely, the mound builders in southern Michigan were over in the Kalamazoo and Grand River watershed on the west side of the state. So we don't have a lot of that influence in southeast Michigan, but even more specifically in the immediate area of Iron Creek Preserve, except for a handful of mounds in the heart of the Irish Hills to the southwest. So the first European explorers of southern Michigan came through in 1600, or the early 1600s, I should say. And I feel like it's important to kind of realize that in the early 1600s, Michigan was already largely devoid of domestic life as we would think of it. There was a series of events known as the Beaver Wars, in which the Iroquois of New York were allied with the Dutch and English, and the Dutch and English happily traded firearms for beaver pelts. And so the Iroquois were very well armed, and they kind of blew through the Ohio River Valley and into Michigan and pushed all these tribes out of Michigan and the Ohio River Valley with the intent of using these Michigan in this area as hunting grounds for beaver pelts. And the Anishinaabe who were living there were allied largely with the French, who were a little bit more religious and didn't necessarily believe in trading off all these firearms for pelts. Even though it was a much more healthy relationship, they didn't give as many guns. Amazing how that works out. And so the Anishinaabe were largely overpowered and pushed out to the upper peninsula of Michigan, to Wisconsin. and this is starting in the early 1600s. And so as these first European explorers are coming through, there's, maybe there's roving war bands or hunting bands going through the area, but there's no families to sit down with and talk about the culture of the area or that kind of thing. And then in 1701, you have the Great Peace of Montreal, and Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac comes to Detroit, founds Detroit, or he comes to Southeast Michigan, founds Detroit, and invites all these tribes back to the area, because the Beaver Wars are over, essentially. And so it's kind of wild to realize that these people that are coming back to Southeast Michigan are perhaps the grandkids of those that were pushed out at the beginning of the Beaver Wars. So if they have any knowledge of this place, it's maybe whispers of what their grandparents told them as kids. And so coming back, they it's not even necessarily the same tribes. They've already been displaced, and it's anybody coming back because they all want trade. And they don't know very much about the specifics. They still have this very deep-seated understanding of what it means to live on the land in a healthy way, but they don't have the acute knowledge of well, this is where you can go for this resource, this is where you can go for that resource, so these kinds of things. And so that's looking at this map, which I'll explain more in a little bit. You can kind of realize that some of the things on here may be from 5,000 years ago, but some of these things are only from 200 years ago, from people who were pretty much new settlers to the area as much as our ancestors were. They didn't know much more about the specific details of this place. And so a lot of the more kind of what we think is the interesting stuff, like the planting grounds and the burial grounds, is really very recent in the scheme of human history here. And only a few of these things have really persisted over the thousands of years. So I can't do this talk without just kind of talking about this, because I think it's super important. In 1701, the tribes are invited back. In 1785, you have the first land lost to treaty in Michigan. And so that's a little bit of land along the area of Monroe. So it took them 85 years to essentially have their first land taken away from them. And in 1842, you have the last land lost in Michigan. So over the course of 60 years, you have the whole of Michigan. That's one person's lifetime. The whole of Michigan is lost to these people. And I'll give you an example of just how that was done. So in the 1807, there was the Treaty of Detroit, and that was the treaty essentially that dealt with this land specifically. So the Treaty of Detroit in 1807 was a treaty for 7.5 million acres, which is essentially all of Southeast Michigan, from the Thumb to Lansing in a straight line down. Sorry, I get worked up talking about this.
I'm with you.
So 7.5 million acres, and it was traded for $10,000 in money and goods. And so that's not just $10,000 in cold hard cash, that's $10,000 in maybe cash, but also smallpox blankets and a couple of hatchets. So does anybody want to give a guess of what $10,000 is in today's money?
$2 million.
$2 million, that's a very generous guess. No, in today's money, $10,000 would be $235,000. So I could potentially buy a house in this area with what they were given. So if you do the math from 10 years ago and you assume that an acre is $10,000 an hour, or $10,000 an acre, 7.5 million acres times $10,000 an acre is $75 billion that they would have been paid in today's money at the going market rate. This is pre-COVID, so you can imagine that it's probably 75 trillion now, based on the last 10 years. So, when people wonder why, sorry. But these tribes that came back to the area, they are humans, and they're looking for a lot of the same things that we are. They need water, they need places to find food, and they were agricultural. They need places to grow their food. And so naturally the Irish Hills, with the varied topography and all the lakes, make a great spot where, like as I was mentioning before, all that kind of different ecosystem types come together. You have a lot of wetlands, you have a lot of topography that's creating zones. You know, the north side of a hill is different than the south side of a hill. And so you can look at this map and see a lot of kind of reasons why they chose what they chose. So again, here, this is Iron Creek Mill Pond, and this little flower sign right here is on the south side of a large hill, where south sides are often drier, they're sunnier, and drier, sunnier spots respond to fire better, so they're going to be more open and clear. That little plant sign is an old planting ground, because likely over thousands of years that area stayed open and it was easy to till that place up and plant food there. So that's one of the kind of the more very definitive things we can see about how people were living in this very specific place. You know, this is only maybe a quarter mile east of the preserve. You had this planting ground, and it's right along Iron Creek where you have flowing water. You know, there's going to be fish in what was there before the mill pond. These two signs are for kind of like quote-unquote campgrounds. They're not necessarily villages, but they're places where maybe people stayed for a period of time when they were on a hunting trip or something. And it's a little bit obvious. Here's a lake. There's also a lake under this orange flag here. And so that orange flag is there, and this one is here, because we are lucky enough to know the names of those two bodies of water from the indigenous perspective. This came from a book, The History of Washtenaw County, and I don't know the specific, I don't know the source that the author of this book got their knowledge from, but Iron Creek Mill Pond was known as Biwabico, which translates to of iron. And so you can see that maybe the whole name of Iron Creek came from this indigenous knowledge of the area, and you might ask, well, they didn't have iron tools, how did they know that this was iron? Well, it's not that they knew that it was iron, but if you walk along the creek, there are lots of springs flowing into the creek, and all the springs have this rich orange substance coming out of the springs that we know as iron, but they probably just said, this is a defining feature of this creek, is these orange springs, and we call it Biwabico. So it's not necessarily a direct translation of they're like, oh, this is hard iron that we're making tools with, but it is that kind of understanding of this is what makes this creek unique among other creeks in the area, was that essentially the iron coming out of the ground there. And this here is a small lake actually across the house, or across the road from the house I grew up in, that was known as Sigwan Kichigami. Sigwan translates to the season of the spring, and Kichigami, if you're familiar with Wadsworth or Longfellow's poem?
Yes.
Gitchagumi, exactly. So it's a dialect, but it is the same word as Gitchagumi, the great water. So that lake translates into the great water in the spring. And you might say, well, what's that about? Well, if you look at that lake, it's surrounded on all sides by wetland, and before it was ditched, before the drainage was ditched, you can imagine that during the spring, that lake would have, flooded and grown to be 2, 3, 4 times its size during the dry season. And so again, that's another example of just like, they didn't name the lake after who lived there. They named the lake after what they observed it doing over the years. They were there for so long. They're like, every spring this lake does this. And they began to know it as the place that's, you know, the great water in the season of the spring. So, as I noted, all these green lines are trails from various sources. This one right here is US 12, also known as the Old Sauk Trail. And here, this straight line is where 12 runs currently, but, excuse me, these two lines are the actual original path, according to different sources, of that Great Sauk Trail. And so instead of dipping down into Lenawee County for political reasons, people came and crossed Iron Creek right here at about where Hensey Road is. And I think it's interesting to note that we still have a crossing over Iron Creek where there has been a crossing for thousands of years. And this skull and crossbones and this skull and crossbones are potential sites of Indian burial grounds, again from different sources. So lastly, I also, I think I'm running out of time here, but these three trails are from a map that I've yet to relocate. I found it once long ago, and I've yet to relocate it, but there's actually a wetland up here that still has a species of edible blueberry-like plant. I forget the actual specific, it's not truly a blueberry, but it tastes a lot like a blueberry and grows a lot like a blueberry. And so you can imagine that these trails were here because that blueberry bog, I'll call it, was there, and it's still there today. I've been there as a kid. It's on private land that I don't necessarily have access to anymore. But those blueberries are still there. These plants that people were harvesting and thought that it was important to know. Somebody thought it was important to note that on a map because that was a huge source of food for them. And so it's really amazing to me that those berries are still there, hopefully being disturbed. And I think I hear Sybil whispering to Aline that that's a legacy protected.
Yes.
Well, protected by Raisin Valley.
Oh, right. Which is going to legacy. So that's a really amazing kind of tidbit of just how the landscape can really affect how we think of it and how we remember parts of it. Okay, there was one other thing. So I like to share this because this map started because I grew up right here just south of Iron Creek Preserve, and I wanted to know as much as I could about the specific Indigenous history as close to my home as possible. And so this has ballooned into what hopefully becomes a statewide project, even though nobody knows about it except you now. So if you want to be involved, feel free to come talk to me. It's a lot of reading chicken scratch. But just for a little one last, there is an old bent oak tree here at the notes say that it was at the entrance to the old English farm. And you'll see that, the old Sauk Trail is curving north there, and then if you had saw more of the map, you'd see it curves east. And so you can see that tree was there marking a curve in the trail, and that trail goes on to cross the River Raisin at the kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a ghost village, known as Podunk, where there used to be a dam. And I think that's really interesting that, this will be my last little bit, that a lot of the reasons, stuff that, dams and river crossings require the same features. And so it's not necessarily that these roads led to villages that were created. It's there were already trails leading to these spots that happened to be good dam sites. And so it's not that Europeans came along, built these dams, and roads came to them. It's these trails were already here to these locations, and we made use of it because we're all humans looking for the same stuff. So with that, obviously that's just a snippet of 10,000 years, but feel free to come talk to me if you have any more questions.
A real quick question.
Yeah?
That map shows Iron Mill Pond as it exists today. The one prior to that to show the trails. During that time, was that pond that big?
No, it was not. And if we go back to the other map that has the, you can see that kind of light blue is their approximation of the original pond. And you can see this, this blue lobe here is a wet prairie. And so when the pond got dammed, that wet prairie got flooded, and the pond became twice as 3, 4, 5 times as big as it originally was. So.